So what we were in the middle of doing when we took this sidetrack to talk about PSR4 and hook menu is we wanted to add a page to our module. So first, we need a route to define the path that will render our page. And second, we need a controller to build the content of the page. We're going to start with the controller. So if we jump back to our resource pack directory, what we'll do is copy the 11th step, which is blinddatecontroller.php, controller for example page. We'll copy this and paste it inside of our blind date folder and rename it to blinddatecontroller.php. Let's open this up to take a look. This controller is about as simple as it gets. Now, it might look like a lot of code for what it does, but it's basically boilerplate. It's something that you'll most likely copy and paste or use a template for every time you create one. We're defining the namespace as Drupal/blinddate/controller, so that's the name of the module/controller. We're going to use the controller base class, which is in the Drupal core controller namespace. Our controller is going to be a class that extends the controller base, and then we'll have a function that returns the output. Now, this output can be a string or it can be a render array. We've talked about render arrays in the Drupal 7 series, and render arrays in Drupal 8 are very similar. We're setting up the render array with a single item, which is markup, and that will be rendered just as plain HTML. And in it, we're passing some text. So normally, if we have some text that we need translated, we would use the T function in Drupal 7. But in Drupal 8, we're going to use this T instead. We're not going to get deep into where this comes from, but this is the standard. If you look across the code base in Drupal 8, we can see numerous examples of this. Okay, so now we have our controller. And just in case you're coming into this midway, we've talked a lot about controllers throughout this series, what their role is, how to use them in both Symfony, and early on in this series, we talked about controllers in the context of Drupal. But the controller is basically an intermediary between raw data and the way that we view that data ultimately. In this case, we're not doing anything very complicated, but this structure allows for a more predictable approach to connecting up data with output. Okay, so now we have a controller. In order to get this controller to return a value for a page, we need to define a route, which basically defines the existence of a page and tells us where we can find the content for that page. So let's jump to our resource pack directory to grab that route. It's going to be the 12th step, which is blinddate.routing.yml, routing definition for example page. And we'll copy this. Then jump back to our blind date directory, paste it in, and rename it blinddate.routing.yml. Let's check this out. I'm going to open it in the editor. So the bulk of this should look identical to the routing that we developed for our Symfony project just a little bit ago. We have the name of the route. We have the path that it defines. We have the path where it can be found. We have a set of defaults. And on this particular route, we're using different values here than we saw in our routes.yml file for our Symfony project. In that project, we used _controller in order to define the controller. And we could do the same thing in our routing here. If we did that, then Drupal would expect us to return a full response object. That's the response object that we were working with in Symfony. Instead, what we're doing right now is returning a render array, and we could also return a string. And if we're going to do that, then it expects us to set the value for the _content parameter here. The value of this is the full namespace to the controller plus the method that's going to be called to return it. And we'll use double colons between the full namespace and that method. We also set the title here, which if you worked with Drupal 7, we would have set as the title attribute in hook menu. And we're setting it to welcome to your example page. Another item we didn't have in our routes.yml file back in our Symfony example is this requirements. Now in the requirements section, we can check for particular conditions that allow this page to be viewed. So for example, in order to view this page, you need to have the permission access content. But we can also check to see if a module exists, and other modules can set up additional requirement checkers too. Most of the time though, we're going to want to check permission. Okay, so now we have our routing.yml file, we have our controller. So our controller file actually needs to belong in a place where it can be discovered by the autoloader. Because we're using PSR4 now, all we need to do is stick it in our source folder and then in a controller folder inside of that. So let's create our source folder. I'll create a new folder, src, and inside of this, I'll open it up And I'm going to create a new folder called controller. Then I'll pop back up to our module. And I'm going to drag over blind date controller to our controller folder. Just like in Drupal 7, we'll need to clear our caches in order to register this new page. So let's go back to the browser and we'll go to configuration. We'll click on performance and we'll click clear all caches. So now we should be able to go to blind date. That's the path. I'll just copy it, jump back to the browser, and in the address bar, paste it in and hit enter. Hey, welcome to your example page. This is where we put all the things. Awesome, so we have our page.